We are recording, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Andrea Pipp, who is the program botanist at the Montana Natural Heritage Program. Andrea earned a BA in biology and an MS in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, but she kind of became more interested in vascular plants because every wildlife job that she had required studying the habitat. And then she got intrigued by mosses and liverworts and fungi, and she took a liking to the lichens. So her master's study examined how the age and structure of the forest influences the diversity and biomass of lichens that grow in the tree canopy. So all in all, Andrea has 38 years of botany and wildlife experience working in 12 different states for federal, state, and private sectors. And she's now in her 10th year at the Montana Natural Heritage Program. And in her position, she manages the botany database, which, if you're not familiar with it, is our state's source for information on the species status and distributions of Montana's native and exotic flora, emphasizing species of concern. So her particular field involves vascular plants, but also bryophytes, lichens, fungi, algae, cyanobacteria, good luck, Andrea, and diatoms. So welcome, Andrea, and I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you to share your screen and tell us about this wonderful mammoth enterprise that is just concluded with an actual plan for our state.
All right. Well, thank you, Gretchen. And I'll let go of admitting people right now. And I will share my screen and get my presentation running here. And I want to thank everybody and the Native Plant Society for inviting me to talk today. Okay. Can you guys see my first slide?
Yes.
Yes, that's up.
Okay. And you're just seeing a single slide right now. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. Great. All right. Well, I'm going to start off with a little story about how this strategy began. Just bear with me here. All right. So at the 2018 Montana Native Plant Conservation Conference, I presented on Colorado and New Mexico's efforts to create their rare plant conservation strategies. And I asked participants, does Montana need a statewide rare plant strategy? The response was an overwhelming yes, Montana needs one. So from the conference, a steering committee of botanists formed, represented by the Montana Native Plant Society with Marie Mantis, Montana Dakota's Bureau of Land Management with Wendy Vellman, Region 1 Forest Service with Steve Shelley, and the Montana Natural Heritage Program with myself. We spent a year doing our homework. We invited 28 potential partnering organizations, federal and state land management agencies, tribal nations, nonprofit conservation organizations, academia, and private entities to pursue its development. And in 2019, we hosted an in-person kickoff meeting. 22 botanists and biologists representing 20 organizations attended. The steering committee presented their vision and their rationale for a Montana rare plant conservation strategy. Now, silently to yourself, can you guess what their response was? They said, what about native plants important to pollinators? And one agency botanist recalled her work with a landowner group who planted showy milkweed because it's important to monarch butterflies, and another group of weed sprayers who herbicided showy milkweed because it gets weedy. They said, what about riparian forests? Our cottonwoods the regeneration is declining in places. They said, what about aspen? Not as a tree, but as a community. Those communities are getting overused. What about unique habitats? Geologically unique areas that are also important to some rare plants. And what about herbaria? About the challenges they face while advancing plant conservation. Thus began the effort to create a Montana native plant conservation strategy for vascular plant species and habitats of greatest conservation need. The purpose is to promote the collective and coordinated stewardship of Montana's native flora and habitats, using a partnership of people and organizations, using a non-regulatory approach and voluntary actions to ensure the persistence of native plant species and habitats, emphasizing those vulnerable to loss. And so tonight I want to introduce the authors, address why plants and this strategy matter, share 5 constraints hindering efforts to conserve native plants, convey how the authors envision native plant conservation, introduce you to the plant species, unique habitats, and plant communities of greatest conservation need, and 4 critical elements that intersect with their conservation. In 2022, a core team stepped up to write the strategy. Robert Thimble, a retiree from Washington State Parks who moved to Montana and contacted me about volunteer opportunities. Elizabeth Bergstrom, retired U.S. Forest Service botanist and Montana Native Plant Society board member. Steve Shelley, Region 1 botanist for the U.S. Forest Service, who retired in 2020. Steve Cooper, retired ecologist for the Montana Natural Heritage Program. Aaron Clausen, Montana manager for the World Wildlife Fund. Karen Newland, the Regional Recovery Project Manager for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Paul Rogers, professor at Utah State University and director of the Western Aspen Alliance. Wendy Velman, botany program lead for the Montana Dakotas Bureau of Land Management. Dennis Longknife Jr., who serves as the RMP coordinator for the Fort Belknap Indian Community Environmental Protection Department. Colette Work, a Fort Belknap tribal member who has worked as a non-source point pollution coordinator and teaches welding at the tribal college. Beverly Skinner, a habitat biologist for Lost Trail National Wildlife Refuge, who recently retired. Tara Luna, a botanical consultant, and Maddie Crawford, a botanist who was on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, but now works in South Dakota. Behind the work of these authors is a large partnership that deserves a great deal of credit. And this slide shows, lists the partnership of people that from 2018 to 2024 participated at some level in either becoming a representative of their agency, attending meetings, joining working groups or subcommittees, editing, providing expertise, literature, or other feedback. And in today's presentation, I appreciate the photographers who graciously donated their photographs. And in the strategy, you know, they are given credit as well, and there's a lot more of them. But tonight I want to especially give a thank you to Dee Blank. So native plants are an integral component of Montana's biological diversity, functional ecosystems, cultural heritage, and economic sustainability. All of us tonight understand that humans rely on plants for the oxygen that we breathe in, and that our relationship goes far deeper because plants need the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. This reciprocal exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen makes life possible and sustainable for all people and for nearly all life on Earth. It is the native plants and habitats that form the places where we live, work, and recreate, creating innumerable dependencies on them for food, medicine, shelter, tools, spiritual practices, well-being, and much more. Despite the importance of native plants, significant portions of Montana's wild populations, plant communities, and their ecological interactions are functionally degraded and in danger of being lost. Despite our reliance on native plants, it is a continual challenge to encourage most of humanity to understand, respect, and care for Montana's native plant species and habitats, especially those of conservation concern. So the need to create this strategy arose from 5 constraints that have hampered plant conservation efforts in Montana and across the nation. Number 1, insufficient current data and mapping of native plant populations, unique habitats, and communities. From about the 1970s to the early 2000s, the focus was on surveying plant species and community types and identifying rarity. This generated a lot of plant data relevant to the time period. It deposited specimens into agency and university herbaria, and it laid the foundation for tracking habitat changes and population trends. Today, more than 4,000 rare plant occurrences for species of concern and potential species of concern have not been visited for at least 10 years. There is also the need to consider cultural values, especially in helping to determine a species status. So as a result, a large portion of Montana's plant-related data is now old, incomplete, and/or imprecisely mapped, especially for plant species, unique habitats, and plant communities of greatest conservation need. Today, there is a need to consider or even integrate Western science methods and indigenous knowledge using respectful and appropriate methods, because it would facilitate collaboration for stewardship, provide more complete information for management planning, decision-making, and projects, and make species status assessments more accurate and relevant. So number 2, declining recognition for botanical expertise and appreciation for plants. There has been a decline in botanical degrees and coursework offered to students. For the 50 top funded universities in the US, 18 schools stopped offering advanced botany degrees from 1988 to 2015. Traditional degrees in botany have been dropped or retooled into various flavors of biology, environmental studies, agricultural sciences, and other programs. Our Montana University system no longer offers a botany degree, and overlapping this academic trend is the consolidation of government botany positions into range, wildlife, and other natural resource job classifications. When compared to wildlife biologists at the federal level, botanists have encountered heavier workloads matched with lower pay, in part due to increasing needs to address invasive plants, plant restoration, and rare plant management. So while there's a shortage of botanists nationwide, Montana has actually fared much better. And in the past 4 years and at the federal level, the Forest Service and the BLM have hired more botanists. For indigenous people, there has also been a decline of botanical knowledge, which is rooted in other causes, from the legacies created by colonialism, forced assimilation, to the loss of ancestral lands, languages, and discrimination. And it was only between the 1970s to 1984 that tribal colleges were established on Montana's 7 reservations. So now each reservation hosts a 2 or 4 year college. So my takeaway message is not of judgment, because times change and sometimes we have to learn new ways of working. My takeaway message is that there is an overall decline in botanical capacity, jobs, knowledge, appreciation, and the authors believe that botanical knowledge and science education are essential to the application of best land management practices, sound conservation decision-making, and having an engaged, environmentally literate society. Number 3, limited funding allocated to native plant conservation. In comparison to wildlife conservation, plant conservation efforts are less funded at the federal and state levels. There are also fewer funding opportunities available for native plant projects. At the state level, plant funding tends to focus on noxious and invasive species or wetland habitats. In the last 3 years, Congress has recognized this need, and there has been bipartisan support to provide funding opportunities for plants of greatest conservation need through the state wildlife action plans. And I'll return to this topic later. The authors believe that directly funding native plant conservation is the most effective means to ensure their persistence. Number 4, inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms to manage native plants and habitats. Federal laws have the strongest protections for plants, but they only apply to federally designated plants growing on federal lands or projects on state lands funded by federal dollars. Montana has very few state laws that directly protect native plants. The Montana Environmental Policy Act, MEPA, addresses state actions that affect the quality of the human environment, and that includes plants. Under MEPA, state agencies write their own administrative rules, and only a few agencies have a few administrative rules that govern rare or native plants. With very few exceptions, federal and state laws do not govern rare plants on private land. Yet, private land accounts for 63% of Montana's land base. And as I'll demonstrate later, private landowners play an important role in the long-term conservation and stewardship of native plant species and habitats. Number 5, increasing threats to native plant species, unique habitats, and plant communities. Montana's native plants and habitats face an increasing array of threats from multiple vectors. And it's important to define what a threat is. The strategy defines it as an activity or process that has caused, is causing, or may cause destruction, degradation, and/or impairment to the species, biodiversity, or natural processes. So this slide lists common threats that have the potential to cause harm depending upon the specific species and environmental conditions. Given these 5 constraints, native plant conservation faces many challenges, but it is not all doom and gloom. The authors believe that conserving, researching, and sustainably managing Montana's native plant diversity and resources requires an educated, informed, engaged, and coordinated botanical network across the state. We see plant conservation and solutions to constraints happening at multiple levels by different players, working for federal, state, and local government agencies, tribal nations, educational institutions, conservation organizations, and individuals. Pursued or implemented by a single entity or as a collaborative effort by individuals, organizations, tribes, and government agencies. And this photo shows native plant restoration and Superfund remediation along the Clark Fork River, which in my personal and my professional opinions exemplifies many of the tactics promoted in the strategy. So the strategy outlines goals and objectives for plant species, unique habitats, and plant communities of greatest conservation need from 4 areas of conservation. First area, information needs. It outlines goals and objectives where inventory, monitoring, and research would fill in knowledgeable gaps about the species, unique habitat, or plant community of greatest conservation need, and other native plants. The second area, protection and restoration, outlines goals and objectives for the protection of the land or habitat, and restoration actions that address planting and growing the species. Collectively, they would further the persistence or viability of native plants. The third area, education and outreach, outlines goals and objectives where education and other forms of disseminating information would create awareness, empower a person's skills, knowledge, or abilities, and help build a network of informed citizens about a plant species, unique habitat, and plant communities. Education and outreach come in many formats, including written, spoken, taught, mentored, self-learned, or some other format. The fourth area, policy and regulation. Federal and state laws, policies, agency regulations, administrative rules, and landowner rights have an impact, positive or negative, on how we use, manage, and conserve the land, native plants, and all beings. What the authors created and the partnership supported is a strategy that is not regulatory, that is accomplished through existing processes and voluntary actions rather than forced by a policy or a law. While a lack of regulation can hinder native plant conservation, many would argue that conservation is more effective when it is incorporated more as a way of life. Regardless, plant conservation has to work and within established policies and regulations. And the strategy aims to acknowledge policies and regulations that positively impact native plant conservation in hopes of garnering more support for them, to retain them, or improve upon. All right, so I have now presented the background for Montana's native plant conservation strategy presented in the introduction. I want to take a deep breath. I want all of us to take a deep breath, nurture ourselves with the oxygen given to us from plants, release our carbon dioxide to them. And now I want to take you on a quick tour through the 7 components of the strategy. In section 2, the authors of the strategy acknowledge tribal sovereignty. While all people depend upon native plants for life, indigenous peoples were the original land stewards and have the closest relationships to plants, lands, waters, animals, minerals, and other beings. Further, we recognize that plant conservation is not truly accomplished without inclusion by Native Americans and the 8 tribes who own and manage lands in Montana. This section provides some perspectives on plant conservation and from some Native American viewpoints. This section suggests some actions to improve working relationships with Native American people. And I want to paraphrase just a few examples from the strategy. Respect and reinforce Native American people's self-determination as practitioners of biodiversity conservation and ecological protection. Promote the retention of culturally valued plant species both on and off the reservation to help sustain indigenous economies, traditional ecological knowledge systems, livelihoods, meanings, and identities. Strive to develop respectful relationships through asking, listening, and discussing. Section 3 addresses botanical capacity. And botanical capacity is the capabilities of the people and cultures, science, technology, organizations, institutions, and resources to support plant-based education and training, basic and applied research, and environmental monitoring and management. Botanical capacity is critical to conserving, maintaining, and managing the diversity of Montana's native flora and the many important ways that native plants sustain people, animals, and habitats. Section 3 addresses the ways that botanical knowledge has been gained from indigenous peoples and immigrants, where it has been eroded and fractured, and the need to reawaken if we are to conserve Montana's flora in this rapidly changing world. Section 3 identifies goals and objectives that would strengthen botanical capacity across Montana for all people and reduce the 5 constraints hampering native plant conservation. I want to paraphrase just a few examples from the strategy. So for information needs, which are inventory, monitoring, and research, some examples are on the Montana Natural Heritage Program website, develop a web page to centralize information relative to the Montana Native Plant Conservation Strategy. Recognize the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation Nursery as a production hub of the Montana Native Seed Network, which facilitates research. Participate in the Montana Native Plant Conservation Conference, which tackles emerging issues in applied botany. And many of you listening tonight are involved with various roles of either attending or putting on the conference. And it's very informative and successful. So, give yourself a little pat on the back. Protection and restoration. Strengthen Montana's native plant material supply chain by fostering partnerships and information between public and private sectors. Support Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks administered programs aimed at conserving native habitats. Develop a restoration working group to address statewide topics with native plants. For education and outreach, become a member of a plant-focused nonprofit, the Montana Native Plant Society, the Plant Conservation Alliance. And do you guys know that in Montana, the Native Plant Society is the only organization strictly focused on native plants? And most of you are members, and I want to recognize that the importance of that membership. So give yourself a pat on the back for being a member. Advocate for Montana's institutions of higher education to add back in botanical coursework and/or degrees. Convene a panel of educators and botanists to develop plant-based curricula that also meets grade level criteria for primary and secondary education. Preserve and protect traditional knowledge sharing between generations and the practices, observations, methods, and technologies held by Indigenous people for conserving and enhancing native plant diversity and cultural preservation. Policy and regulation. Adhere to the state of Montana laws governing the regulation of wildcrafting. Acknowledge and adhere to federal and tribal laws, ordinances, regulations, and policies to protect traditional knowledge of plants as the intellectual property of tribal nations, individual tribal members. Join the Native Plant Society's Conservation Committee to consider public policy issues and communicate concerns on native plants. Section 4 identifies and prioritizes 109 plant species of greatest conservation need. This slide shows the 109 plant species of greatest conservation need by scientific name. 105 are Montana species of concern plants, and 4 are management or cultural concern, in which partners of the strategy representing different agencies expressed concerns for their persistence. And those 4, are western white pine, green ash, quaking aspen, as a community, not as an individual stem, and northern sweetgrass. Nominated by a subcommittee, they all face significant or highly probable threats to their species or their habitat. Some plants also associate with a unique habitat or plant community of greatest conservation need, and some plants are also in need of inventories. So conservation actions that are either continued, expanded, or implemented would greatly help to ensure their persistence. In the upper right corner is a map of Montana showing the general locations for the 109 plant species of greatest conservation need, as mapped by the Montana Natural Heritage Program. And for this presentation, ignore the colors, just focus on the general locations. The lower left graph displays the ecological systems where these 109 plant species are found. The bars represent the percentage of total acres in Montana for each ecological system. And on top of each bar is the number of plant species of greatest conservation need. So the graph illustrates that the 109 plant species occur in all ecological systems: grasslands, forest, human use, shrubland, disturbed, wetland, riparian, sparse, and barren, and alpine. Grasslands, forests, shrublands, wetlands, and sparse barren ecological systems are of particular importance to guide conservation. Again, you see the map of Montana showing the general locations for the 109 plant species of greatest conservation need. Ignore those color distinctions. On the lower left graph is a display of land ownership, where those 109 plant species are found. And the bars represent the percentage of total acres in Montana for each land ownership type. On the top of each bar is the number of plant species of greatest conservation need. So the graph illustrates that the 109 plant species occur across the full spectrum of land ownerships. And this graph illustrates that private landowners are very important to the conservation of these species, along with federal and state agencies. Section 4 identifies general conservation goals and objectives that would help conserve most, if not all, plant species of greatest conservation need. And I want to paraphrase just a few examples of objectives from the strategy. So for information needs, support and fund the long-term establishment of a Montana Citizen Botany Program, jointly developed by the Montana Native Plant Society and the Natural Heritage Program. This program engages citizens in plant-focused conservation tasks. And I want to acknowledge that many of you are supporting this effort, which is bringing forth current data on our rare plants, including plant species of greatest conservation need. So pat yourself on the back. Where management, human activities, or potential threats occur in vicinity of a plant species of greatest conservation need, design monitoring or research studies to evaluate any cause and effect response. Protection and restoration. Prevent, minimize, and control the spread of noxious and invasive plants and animals, especially in vicinity of plant species of greatest conservation need. Work with the Montana Department of Transportation and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to revise goals for wetland mitigation and banking that gives landowners credits for protecting a native plant that has cultural value. Improve coordination between the Native Plant Society and the Natural Heritage Program to jointly determine the best ways to disseminate information on important plant areas in Montana. The Society initiated the Important Plant Area Program, and through the Society, these areas support outstanding rare plant assemblages and are given recognition. Policy and regulation. Integrate plant species of greatest conservation need into the 2025 revision of the State Wildlife Action Plan, known as SWAP. The SWAP serves as a funding mechanism whereby federal funds can be appropriated towards conservation for species and habitats determined to be greatest conservation need. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is the designated agency for developing Montana SWAP and updating it every 10 years. The 2025 update is due later this year, and we've been working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to get this list of plant species of greatest conservation need added to the SWAP. And so far we have very supportive from the agency. Outreach and education. Coordinate with the Strategy Stewards Committee to develop species-specific working groups that would develop and write conservation profiles for the remaining plant species of greatest conservation need. I'm going to pause and I'm taking you to Appendix A. Appendix A provides species-specific conservation goals and objectives for 5 plant species of greatest conservation need: sapphire rockcress, Spalding's catchfly, Ute lady's tresses, whitebark pine, and water hewellia. These conservation profiles now serve as a template because the strategy is not done. The goal is to create conservation profiles for the remaining 104 plants using working groups and other tactics. Section 5 identifies and prioritizes 9 unique habitats of greatest conservation need. They were nominated by members of the partnership with extensive botanical and ecological experience in Montana. And this slide lists the 9 unique habitats. Unique habitats develop under unusual conditions of geology, soil chemistry, hydrology, and other environmental factors. They occupy relatively small areas. They may support rare plants or rare plant assemblages. They are often missed in vegetation classification systems, and they truly do contribute to Montana's unique natural heritage. Section 5 identifies general conservation goals and objectives that would help conserve most, if not all, unique habitats of greatest conservation need. And I want to paraphrase just a few examples of objectives from the strategy. Information needs. Develop a statewide mapping layer for each unique habitat using existing data and identify areas where there's potential for additional sites. Coordinate with the Strategy Stewards Committee to establish working groups to address conservation needs for all unique habitats. For protection and restoration, evaluate the need for restoration at known locations for each type of unique habitat. For policy and regulation, encourage state and federal agencies to continue building the Montana Natural Area System by identifying and nominating unique habitat sites to the Board of Land Commissioners. Outreach and education. Coordinate with the Strategies Stewards Committee to develop working groups that will write conservation profiles for the remaining unique habitats of greatest conservation need. And I'm going to pause here and take you to Appendix B. Appendix B provides habitat-specific conservation goals and objectives for 2 of the unique habitats: Centennial Valley sand dunes and metamorphosed limestone. But the strategy is not finished, and the goal is to create conservation profiles for the remaining unique habitats using working groups and other tactics. But these serve as a template. Section 6 identifies and prioritizes 5 plant communities of greatest conservation need. They were nominated by members of the partnership that work for different agencies, but express similar concerns for their viability. And this slide lists the 5 plant communities of greatest conservation need. They are common, prominent plant communities in Montana that face significant stressors. They may also lack regulatory protections. So Section 6 identifies general conservation goals and objectives that would help conserve most, if not all, plant communities of greatest conservation need. And I want to paraphrase just a few examples of objectives from the strategy. Information needs. Establish working groups to guide and develop and refine the process for addressing plant communities of greatest conservation. Protection and restoration. Collaborate with the Montana Forest Action Advisory Council, Montana SWAP team, and other ecologists to assist in current conservation efforts for plant communities of greatest conservation need, especially those that are forested. Policy and regulation. For forested plant communities of greatest conservation need, consult the Montana Forest Action Plan on assessing forest condition, priority areas to focus on, recommending goals, and implementing strategies. Outreach and education. Coordinate with the Strategy Stewards Committee to develop working groups that will write conservation profiles for the remaining unique habitats of greatest conservation need. And I'm going to pause here and take you to Appendix C. Appendix C provides community-specific conservation goals and objectives for one plant community of greatest conservation need, quaking aspen communities. Take a look at it. It's a great appendix, but it's a template. And again, the strategy is not finished, and the goal is to create conservation objectives for the remaining plant communities using working groups and other tactics. Section 7 addresses the critical roles that herbaria provide for plant conservation. The herbarium preserves physical plant specimens and their associated labels of information, which become the foundation for classifying and communicating plant names, documenting distributions and rarity, facilitating research, and aiding the work of land managers. And these days, you might interact with the herbaria through an online portal, such as the Consortium of the Pacific Northwest Herbaria. But behind that digital information is a network of herbaria that house and manage plant specimens. This section illustrates how herbaria are on the cutting edge of technology, are relevant today, and cannot be replaced by their digital data. This slide shows the locations of the 8 registered and active herbaria addressed by the strategy. The network consists of university, agency, and a private herbarium. Appendix D provides profiles and contact information for those 8 herbaria. And Section 7 suggests goals, objectives, and actions to ensure their continued service to plant conservation. I want to paraphrase just a few examples of objectives from the strategy. Communicate to decision makers and university stakeholders the rationale for supporting each university herbarium with a collections manager, a curator, and student internships. Organize a Montana-based herbaria working group that would advocate for the preservation, function, and relevance of herbaria. When using information sourced by an online portal or herbarium, credit the actual herbarium that directly digitizes a specimen and manages the data. Join or create a herbarium support group, and the Friends of the University of Montana Herbarium is a successful example. Section 8 illustrates the reciprocal relationship between native plants, plant communities, and animal pollinators that is necessary to conserve if these native species are to persist. Section 8 is not a strategy. Rather, we link readers to resources to help agencies, community organizations, and individual landowners grow native plants and plant communities to benefit both pollinators and pollinizers. And with a little effort and research, native plant species and communities can be created in small places like your own backyard. So if you have not, then I would encourage each of you to find some time to read the entire strategy for specific sections. Throughout the document, there are many more conservation objectives that can be accomplished by an individual, a single organization or agency, and through collaboration. If the document is too big, then consider reading the executive summary. And so this now ends my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to stop sharing right now.
Andrea, thank you so much. Take a breath, get a drink of water, and people have not been typing questions into the chat. I think we can be pretty casual right now. I'm going to stop the recording.